Okay, so we're back for a section called Strategies, What to Do When the Angels Are Missing. And I had you guys read the second section of that chapter, or that section, I should say, it's of the book, chapter 10, Transparency, Whistleblowing, and Dissent. But you might want to read the introduction too. It's called Strategies, of course, What to Do When the Angels Are Missing. And it's got some good overviews of the section. The reason why I didn't have you read the chapter right after that is because it's a little bit dated, right? And that's because, codes of conduct, ethical codes are always changing. And a lot of that has to do with the latest codes, but a little bit of it has to do with the history of the development of those things as well. So if you read that, take it for what it's worth. But if you want to find out the latest, as some of my students often say, you can Google that, right? Like you can Google the latest municipal ethical code, or your state's state employee ethical code. One of the things that we've already learned is that codes and rules can only go so far. And so I find that the much more interesting chapter, and the one that has more staying power, is this one on transparency, whistleblowing, and dissent, because that has to do with, what do you as an individual do if you are put into a position where you see somebody in your workplace, maybe even somebody higher up in the chain of command, or a number of people, maybe a whole organization, doing something that you know to be unethical. What do you do? And of course, somehow you need to either stop it or report it. And the question is, how can you do one or both of those in the smartest way possible? So this is what this section is about. I have to say, probably this is not a rarity, that at some point in your career, you will be in this position, and you will have to decide whether a particular issue rises to the occasion of calling attention to it or not. You'll have to think through what are the ramifications for you for calling it to the attention of some other authority or reporting it in some way. You'll ask yourself, is there anything else I can do? You may ask yourself, is there any way I can accomplish this while not ruining my entire life and my career? Those are legitimate questions. Remember the ethical triangle at the beginning, and how consequence is one part of it. Thinking through what are the short and long-term consequences of the different strategies that we might employ, that's reasonable. And it's a part of the process. All right. So we're talking about whistleblowing. We're talking about doing something that is often inherently unpopular, dangerous, and should only be done if it's very clear that there's really no alternative that will accomplish the goal, which should be to stop whatever is happening that is this objectionable. Okay. So the first thing that we probably should do is make some distinctions. And that's a lot of what this chapter does for us with the various selections we have. It distinguishes between our public life and our private life, what we do in our public capacity and what we do in our private capacity. Now, these are liberal distinctions, but we live in a liberal context at the moment, so they're good distinctions to keep in mind. A person, at least a person who's a citizen of the United States of America, might assume that they have freedom of speech that's pretty all-encompassing, for instance. However, a lot of employers treat their employees as if they don't. And we have arguments about whether that's legitimate or not. Employers, both public and private, in other words, both governmental and corporate or business employers, will usually try to circumscribe their employees' speech somehow. So that's already maybe a bit of a problem in that sometimes an employer will try to control even that speech which you do not do in the workplace or that is not related to the workplace. Oftentimes, whether it's right or wrong is another matter, but oftentimes voicing controversial opinions, positions, etc., in a private space, such as your own email, even sometimes, or what you may assume to be your private life domain, such as your own personal Twitter account, right, or something like that. You would assume, perhaps, that you should be able to say what you want in that capacity, as long as you don't do it on behalf of your company. And yet, companies and government employers will often try to push back and say, no, you can't do that because it reflects poorly on us. People know that you're employed by us, et cetera. Now, I will just say, based on what I've seen of, state and federal, rules and regulations regarding this type of thing, what officially passes muster is that as long as you're not saying something in your capacity as an employee or as a representative of your workplace, as long as you don't bring your workplace into it, and as long as you are not doing this speech at your workplace during work time, you are protected. But that doesn't mean that you're actually protected from harassment, from pushback, from threats, from investigations. And I'm here to tell you that this happens quite often, right? That somebody will object. So one message is you've got to be prepared for that. In other words, if you're somebody who feels strongly about your political views or your cultural views or your social views, maybe look ahead of time to see what your rights are, what the letter of the law says, what the ethical codes say in your area. Then go into that knowing what the rules are and what the risks are, and realizing that you may have to defend yourself if you feel strongly about being able to speak your mind outside of work. It usually catches people off guard that this even happens, but it's actually really common. It's another attempt to kind of stifle people's free speech. The flip side of the coin on this dichotomy is that you might think that you ought to have the freedom to speak your mind in your workplace when it comes to this ethical problem, right? So let's say that you go to a board meeting or even you decide to be a little bit more discreet and you just simply write a memo, sort of detailing your view of what's happening and what is actually to be done about it. And you think, well, at least I have the freedom of, speech here. I can say what I want. As I think we'll see in this section, you may not have that right? Because that can be seen as, quote, insubordination. I think that anybody in the workplace who is contemplating dissenting in some way needs to realize that, indeed, that speech may be seen as out of line, actionable, and insubordinate. And that's why it's important to think through your options, right? Instead of doing something just because you feel like it in the moment, or that you want to strike a blow for common sense, only to get fired or transferred or demoted. in which case you can no longer do any good about the situation. Okay. So there's this whole public private murky area. And then we have this distinction between the common good and the private good to consider. And that kind of flows from the last point. It's legitimate to consider one's private good and the good of one's own family. And then you have to weigh the good of the public sometimes, the good of the employees in your workplace, the good of consumers in some cases, against your private good. And these are very uncomfortable, somewhat torturous calculations that people make. If the harm to the common good is very great, it may be worth the damage done to one's own personal private good, one's reputation, one's family's security. So it matters a great deal how egregious the violation is as to how much risk to one's private good one needs to take or should take. So this balance weighs in here. Also, we are going to deal with formal versus informal methods for reporting, with the question, which is better? Is it better to try to kind of, for instance, maybe talk at the water cooler with one's boss about the fact that you saw him taking, supplies from and taking them home, or that he's using the office admin's help for organizing his bookcases at home, or I don't know, you come up with the crazy scenario. They're all everything that I say about this is something I've either seen myself or heard, done or seen in the news, right? So is it better to ask your boss, hey, do you think that asking your admin to go home with you and organize your bookshelves is actually maybe an abuse of power, or maybe it doesn't look so good, I understand the reasons for I'm kind of making fun of this, but that is a legitimate strategy, right? If you can get a person who's doing something pretty kind of it's unethical, it's bad, but maybe it can be corrected. Maybe the person can see that this is inappropriate. It could be a legitimate option. Is it better to try an informal method for many of these things before we get to the point of doing something more formal, in which case it becomes more known to everyone and a certain process is started, whether it's in the company or in the governmental body, that you might not be able to stop even if you wanted to, right? On the one hand, an informal method can sometimes preserve your relationship with the person you're trying to correct, whereas the formal method won't. On the other hand, the informal method, if it doesn't work, comes with its own set of problems, because now you are, among other things, complicit if you don't move beyond the informal method to a formal report or grievance of some kind. Informal methods often don't work because the person that you're talking to is too far gone, ethically speaking, to take an objection seriously. And then all that does is put a target on your head and maybe you will get fired. So there are many things to consider here. Also, which is more important? This comes into the minds of a lot of people. Do I want honesty and for everything to be right and above the board? Or do I just want peace? Peace is important too. Peace in the workplace, people not fighting, having all sorts of grievances being aired. It creates an atmosphere of distrust and negativity and anxiety. And one does have to weigh how, again, a lot of these have to do with just how bad is this thing that we're talking about, right? That you're considering blowing the whistle on or reporting. because there is a value to peace in the workplace. So again, as I said in last week's lectures, if somebody is getting a free cup of coffee and a donut, the peace is more important. However, if somebody is getting a Porsche and a trip to the Bahamas, then maybe not. So we have to be able to gauge the severity and the impact and so on. And then we have to think about, do we definitely want to stay at the employer? Is it important enough that perhaps we want to consider resigning so that we can fully say what we want? Is it important enough that we would be willing to be fired if necessary and maybe even launch some sort of lawsuit? And we'll ask the question, is resignation in and of itself a protest if it's public resignation? In the political world and the administrative world, a lot of times this takes place where a person says, I'm resigning publicly, and I'm going to tell the public why I'm resigning. And it's because, I can no longer work at a workplace where this is going on and I will not be a part of it. And by doing that, they say, and you can't hurt me anymore. You can't threaten me, right? Because I'm no longer employed by you. Although that's not always true that they can't hurt you or threaten you. They might be able to sue you. They might be able to keep you from finding another job. So there are huge risks with going this route. But it is an option, and it's an option that some people, especially in the political realm, have taken. So all of these types of questions and distinctions are going to be in the midst of our discussion. All right. When it comes to whistleblowing, I would say that virtue ethics, that part of that ethical triangle of virtue ethics, or ethics as virtue, is particularly important. If one gets to the point where one is willing to either, blow the whistle, report, in other words, potentially resign, try to sue, or something like that, they are usually moved by their own sense of personal integrity. Okay. If you didn't have a strong sense of personal integrity, then you wouldn't do it. Personal integrity, again, just as a reminder, it means, you define yourself, who you are is an ethical person. Who you are is somebody who will not engage in exploitation and wrongdoing just to get ahead or look the other way while somebody else does that. Who you are won't allow you to do that. And then, who you are is also somebody who wants the common good, that is willing to extend themselves, sometimes heroically, to safeguard the interests and well-being and rights of others. So if that is particularly strong in you and that's been developed in you, then that gives you the strength and courage, if you absolutely have to take that step, even in the face of threats, intimidation, and retaliation. In the worst case scenario, all of that will happen. And I think it would be wrong to say that it's rare, actually. So we all need to be prepared for this. And so a big part of this course really needs to be a sort of self-examination of, who are you? What kind of person are you? What will you put up and won't put up with? What will you put up with and what you won't? And so on. So many of our authors in this chapter remind us that we have a lot of laws, rules, and regulations that say that we are protected if we're whistleblowers, but in almost all cases, they're not perfect and they're not perfectly enforced. Every organization of any size has something. They have ombuds people. They have a process for grievances. But we have to realize that for the most part, those people and processes are in place to keep the worst case scenario from happening, on the worst case scenario from the company's point of view or the organization's point of view. It's to find a way to sort of channel the grievance or issue into a safe zone for the organization. So, what will happen is you will see in writing that a person who reports a problem is protected and that retaliation is not allowed. But at the same time, the organization will have a process that it will ask you to go through. So you might go to the person above your boss and say, I have a problem here with my boss doing this. And you might be told, well, okay, we have an ombuds person here, right? So go there, talk to them. And then the ombuds person gets you to, file some paperwork. And then maybe nothing happens, or maybe down the road something happens, but it happens to you. So blowing the whistle is dangerous, and it's maybe more dangerous when you blow the whistle in your own organization, right? But it's dangerous no matter what. Roberta Johnson's piece here in particular, I think, is very blunt about the way that these things can sometimes be mishandled. She uses terms like dismissal, transfer, demotion, and harassment, right? These are consequences. Also, the so-called nuts and sluts response. This is where, the person who is doing the unethical behavior and or their friends in the organization literally start besmirching your character and calling you either crazy or, in some cases, promiscuous, or, whatever, name your moral problem, a drug or alcoholic, drug user or alcoholic or whatever it may be. That's the nuts and sluts response. Oh, we're just being attacked by these crazy people, right? And they go after your character, and pretty soon, they're still standing, and you've been not only let go, but become unemployable. Just reading from the Wikipedia article on Robert Jackson. He is a U.S. Navy veteran who served as a second-class petty officer on the USS Kitty Hawk and became a whistleblower. In the 80s, Jackson denounced the use of the USS Kitty Hawk to sell F-14 parts and missiles to Iran illegally. Later, it was discovered that this ring of smugglers was part of a wider operation involving 3 different U.S. Navy carriers and an essential part of a more significant conspiracy, later referred to as the Iran-Contra affair, which, if you know your history, became this huge deal, right, that threatened to upend the Reagan presidency, but it did not. Roberta Johnson says of this, the case of the sailor Robert Jackson amply illustrates this attitude in which you basically dismiss besmirch the character of the accuser. When he became a whistleblower, the Navy imputed a range of, quote, personal motives to his action. Although he was portrayed as credible, having appeared on national television and in Time, Newsweek, and People magazines, the Navy characterized him as a bitter and vindictive sailor out to get the captain of the ship for not paying him enough for a training course he submitted through their suggestion program. Jackson, who was a born-again Christian, was also portrayed by Navy officials as an evangelical troublemaker. Okay, so that's a pretty good example of the nuts and sluts response, right? They changed the subject. It wasn't about proving that they hadn't done this thing, but rather trying to impress upon people that this guy was an evangelical nutcase who was just out to get them, the Navy. And then there's Ernest Fitzgerald. So in this case, your author says, Ernest Fitzgerald was an analyst for the Department of Defense who blew the whistle on cost overruns for the large C-5A cargo plane. Starting in 1965, he held the position of Deputy for Management Systems in the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. The Lockheed Aircraft Corporation had contracted to design and build the C-5A. By 1968, they were seriously behind schedule and over budget and needed the federal government's C-5A contract to continue to be able to survive financially. Some members of Congress were opposed to additional funding for the plane. In October 68, the Joint Economic Committee, chaired by Senator William Proxmire, held hearings on the subject, and Fitzgerald was invited to testify. Fitzgerald's superiors, knowing him as a critic of the procurement programs, counseled him to stay away from C-5A in his testimony. Unfortunately, Fitzgerald was specifically asked about the aircraft contract, and he answered truthfully about the billions more than were estimated that it would cost. 7 months later, Fitzgerald was again invited to testify in front of the Joint Economic Committee about another Air Force procurement. Quote, "I was strangely and uncharacteristically depressed by the array of power against me," he wrote. Although warned again for not being too forthcoming in his responses, once more he answered the legislators' questions truthfully and was critical of the project. By November 69, Fitzgerald was notified that his agency position had been eliminated. It took 10 years of creative litigation, including a lawsuit against President Richard Nixon, for Fitzgerald to be reinstated to his Air Force position. So in that case, it was a much more direct response of simply getting rid of the person who was causing problems. So in both of these cases, we have, the U.S. government, in effect, elements in the U.S. government retaliating in very strong ways against people who are simply trying to tell the truth.